Michael Barbaro. And the decision ultimately. Ashley Southall. Who ultimately makes the choice himself. Archived recording, Richard Donahue. In order for a federal criminal civil rights charge to be brought, the Gov must prove beyond an inexpensive doubt that a politician willfully used more force than he reasonably could have believed was necessary under the circumstances. And therefore the law recognizes that police are often forced to form split-second judgments in circumstances that are tense, uncertain and rapidly evolving. Ashley Southall. So one among the most questions of this case is whether or not Officer Pontalio actually used a chokehold. Archived recording, Richard Donahue. As Mr. Garner and Officer Pontalio struggled, Officer Pontalio held onto Mr. Garner and both men fell backward. Within the process, Officer Pontalio's body slammed against a store window, causing the window to buckle. Ashley Southall. And during this explanation, Mr. Donahue said, "Yes, he did." Archived recording, Richard Donahue. It appears that in response thereto collision and to take care of a hold on Mr. Garner, Officer Pontalio wrapped his left arm around Mr. Garner's neck, leading to what was, in effect, a chokehold. Ashley Southall. But here's how prosecutors addressed that question. Archived recording, Richard Donahue. Like many of you, I even have watched that video repeatedly. And every time I've watched it, I'm left with an equivalent reaction. Ashley Southall. There is an emotional side that appears at that tape and says. Archived recording, Richard Donahue. Ashley Southall. That's a tragedy. Archived recording, Richard Donahue. The job of a federal prosecutor, however. Ashley Southall. But then. Archived recording, Richard Donahue. Isn't to let our emotions dictate our decisions. Our job is to review the evidence gathered during the investigation, just like the video, to assess whether we will prove that a federal crime was committed. At the top of the day, however, the video and therefore the other evidence gathered within the investigation doesn't establish beyond an inexpensive doubt that Officer Pontalio acted willfully in violation of federal law. Ashley Southall. What you see on video is extremely clearly an escalation by the officers to form this arrest for this very minor offense. And it ends with Mr. Garner dying. Then internet effect is that in many people's eyes, is just too much. But within the eyes of the law, the prosecutors here, based not just on the video, but on the testimony of witnesses and therefore the testimony of the officers, thought there just wasn't enough. Michael Barbaro. And it now looks like prosecutors seem to possess closed the book on this case. What, if anything, happens now? Is that this case over? Ashley Southall. Throughout these 5 years, Officer Pontalio has been doing a desk job without his gun or his badge. He hasn't been out on patrol. And Michael Barbaro. He remains on the force. Ashley Southall. Yes. There's this process underway within the NYPD which will ultimately end with the Commissioner, James O'Neill, deciding whether or not he gets to remain on the force as a policeman or if he has got to leave. And he could allow him to resign. He could fire him. That call could take weeks, it could take months, or it could happen tomorrow. We don't know. But it's not over for him. Michael Barbaro. So what happens to him may find yourself being the accountability. It's not getting to happen during a courtroom, it seems. It's not getting to happen at the court level or the DA level, but it'd happen inside the NYPD. Ashley Southall. They need also asked for the opposite officers who were involved in his death and people who filed official reports that didn't mention the chokehold, that didn't mention any uses of force, should even be fired and held accountable. Archived recording, Emerald Snipes. I'm getting to stand outside and I'm getting to scream it. Pontalio must be fired. He must be fired. Don't apologize to me. Fire the officer. Don't give me your condolences. I heard that 5 years ago. We would like justice, and that we want it today. Ashley Southall. If that's what the family wants, they need quite the mountain to climb. Officer Pontalio remains on the force. Half the officers' names the family doesn't know, because the town has withheld them. Archived recording, Gwen Carr. This is what we've to measure a day. And you recognize what? We're not getting to take this sitting down. Archived recording. That's right. Archived recording, Gwen Carr. This is not taking place like this, because if it had been one among their loved ones, it might haven't went this far. So my son's death isn't getting into vain. We're getting to fight this to the aggravation if I'm the sole one out on the road. And I've got all of those supporters behind me. Music. Michael Barbaro. Ashley, many thanks considerably. Ashley Southall. Thanks for having me on. Michael Barbaro. We'll be right back. Here's what else you would like to understand today. Archived recording. Archived recording, Mitch McConnell. Well, the president's not a racist. The president's not a racist. Michael Barbaro. Came were bigoted and racist. Archived recording. Mr. Leader, were the president's tweets that said racist? Yes or no? Archived recording, Kevin McCarthy. No, and that I don't. Michael Barbaro. On Twitter, the president himself confronted the allegation, writing that, quote, "I don't have a racist bone in my body." Archived recording, Nancy Pelosi. Michael Barbaro. Hours later, on the House floor, Speaker Nancy Pelosi introduced a resolution condemning Trump's attacks on Representatives Ayanna Pressley, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Archived recording, Nancy Pelosi. To do anything less would be a shocking rejection of our values and a shameful abdication of our oath of office to guard the American people. I urge a unanimous. Michael Barbaro. As Pelosi spoke, House Republicans demanded that she retract her description of the president's comments as racist. Archived recording, Doug Collins. I was just getting to give the gentle Speaker of the House if she would really like to rephrase that comment. Archived recording, Nancy Pelosi. I have cleared my remarks with the parliamentarian before I read them. Archived recording, Doug Collins. I take it, am I able to ask her words be taken down? I make some extent of order, the gentlewoman's words are unparliamentary and prepared to be taken down. Michael Barbaro. House Democrats went on to pass the resolution with the support of just 4 House Republicans. That's it for The Daily. I'm Michael Barbaro. See you tomorrow. Listen 24/11. On Tuesday morning, Mr. Donahue called Mr. Gov couldn't prove Officer Pontalio willfully used excessive force to violate Mr. Garner's rights. The Garner family and its supporters immediately condemned Mr. Barr's decision, saying the Department of Justice had failed them. Mr. Garner's mother, Gwen Carr, shifted the pressure to Mayor Bill de Blasio of latest York, calling on the town to fireside Officer Pontalio and vowing to fight to carry the officers involved within the arrest accountable. We're not departure, so you'll forget that, Ms. Carr said. New Yorkers got to begin and flood this city tomorrow. Evidence doesn't support charging officer in Eric Garner's death, U.S. Attorney says. United States Attorney Richard P. Donahue explained the Department of Justice's decision to not file federal charges against a replacement York City policeman within the death of Eric Garner. Garner's death was a tragedy. For anyone to die under circumstances like these may be a tremendous loss. And therefore the evidence here doesn't support charging policeman Daniel Pontalio, or the other officer, with a federal criminal civil rights violation. United States Attorney Richard P. Donahue explained the Department of Justice's decision to not file federal charges against a replacement York City policeman within the death of Eric Garner. Credit. Richard Drew, Associated Press. The Reverend Al Sharpton, who was standing together with her, added, 5 years ago, Eric Garner was choked to death, today the federal choked Lady Justice, which is why we are outraged. At a later rally on the steps of Hall, a parade of relations, community leaders, local politicians and civil rights lawyers vented their fury at Mr. Barr and other officials. Stuart London, a lawyer for Officer Pontalio, said that his client was gratified to listen to of the Department of Justice decision. Patrick J. Lynch, the president of the Police Benevolent Association, said Officer Pontalio had been unfairly singled out for blame and was completing a superior's orders. Scapegoating an honest and honorable officer, who was doing his job within the manner he was taught, won't heal the injuries this case has caused for our entire city, Mr. Lynch said. From the beginning, the Pontalio investigation sharply divided the Department of Justice. Eric H. Holder Jr., Mr. Obama's Attorney General at the time of Mr. Garner's death, said that evidence strongly suggested the federal should bring charges against Officer Pontalio, albeit it had been notoriously hard to prosecute cops for deaths in custody. July 16, 2019. The last time the federal brought a deadly force case against a replacement York policeman was in 1998, when Officer Francis X Livoti stood trial on, and was eventually convicted of, civil rights charges within the choking death of a Bronx man named Anthony Baez. But the prosecutors within the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn, led by Loretta E. Lynch, didn't believe they might win in court and balked at bringing charges. Once Ms. Lynch succeeded Mr. Holder in April 2015, however, Vanita Gupta, the top of the Civil Rights Division, and her lawyers convinced Ms. Garner's civil rights. Ms. Lynch allowed the Civil Rights Division to require a lead role within the case, and therefore the following September the department replaced the FBI agents and prosecutors who had been performing on the case with a replacement team from outside of latest York. Prosecutors in Washington, D.C. accused their colleagues in Brooklyn of mishandling the investigation. Eric Garner, together with his children in an undated family photo, credit National Action Network via Associated Press. The case stalled again after Mr. Civil Rights Division prosecutors recommended to the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein, that charges be brought, but he declined to maneuver forward. As the Russia investigation engulfed the department and Mr. Sessions was fired, the case languished until Mr. Barr took it up. To the bitter end, prosecutors on each side of the talk lobbied Mr. Barr during a series of briefings, and Mr. Barr reviewed the video multiple times, officials said. But it remains unclear if prosecutors interviewed Mr. Pantaleo, which might have helped establish his state of mind and intent when he put Mr. Garner into a hold. When asked whether prosecutors had interviewed the officer, a Department of Justice official would say only that the department had access to statements relevant thereto analysis. Mr. Barr, within the end, sided with prosecutors in NY. But it is ultimately up to Commissioner James P. O'Neill, the final arbiter of police discipline, to decide whether to fire Officer Pantaleo or punish him in some other way. However, the commissioner won't make a proper decision until the police administrative judge who oversaw a disciplinary trial that led to June renders her verdict, a spokesman for the department, Philip T. Walczak, said during a statement. Credit Demetrius Freeman for the NY Times. Garner died, a standing that has allowed him to accrue pay and pension benefits. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, Democrat of latest York, called the Justice Department's decision an outrage and said the local department must make their departmental findings fully transparent to the general public and take immediate actions to make sure this officer is not any longer on the force. The bottom. The officers had been ordered to arrest him for selling untaxed cigarettes, and he had resisted. A doctor testified at the disciplinary hearing that the pressure on Mr. Beyond the chokehold, the trail to Eric Garner's death. June 13, 2015. Federal prosecutors did a rigorous analysis of the event, but within the end they didn't believe that they had enough evidence to prove beyond an inexpensive doubt that Officer Pantaleo had committed a criminal offense, a senior Department of Justice official said on Tuesday, speaking on the condition of anonymity because he had not been authorized to talk on the record. To prove criminal conduct, the official said, the Gov had to convince a jury that within the middle of a dynamic arrest Officer Pantaleo made a transparent decision to use a chokehold, which the local department had banned quite 20 years ago. It had been a burden that prosecutors didn't believe they might meet, the official said. None of the NY officers involved in Mr. Garner's death are charged with a criminal offense or disciplined by the local department. That fact has enraged the Garner family and various advocacy groups dedicated to holding the police in charge of abuses of power. The state jury declined to bring charges against Officer Pantaleo in December 2014, after he testified in his own defense that he didn't put Mr. Garner into a chokehold, which he had feared he would be pushed through a storefront window during the struggle. The Department of Justice said Tuesday that it had weighed 4 elements: choose whether to charge Officer Pantaleo, including whether he used unreasonable force, whether he willfully violated the law, whether he acted in his official capacity as an enforcement professional, and whether the opposite person was injured. Mr. Donahue said prosecutors didn't believe they might prove he had intentionally used unreasonable force. Albeit they might prove the officer had used force that was objectively unreasonable, the Gov would still need to show the officer did so willfully, a really high level of intent. The Brooklyn prosecutors who studied the video of the encounter concluded that Officer Pantaleo didn't initially shall apply a chokehold, which he eventually did so for 7 seconds after the two men crashed to the bottom, Mr. Donahue said. Mr. Donahue also said that Officer Pontalio had released Mr. Garner from the chokehold before the dying man said, "I can't breathe," and neither Officer Pontalio nor the opposite officers subduing him applied a chokehold then point. Within the end, he said, the video does not establish beyond an inexpensive doubt that Pontalio acted willfully. Reporting was contributed by Ashley Southall, William K. Rashbaum, John Sirico and Derek Norman. Correction, July 16, 2019. An earlier version of this text misspelled the first name of a replacement York senator. She is Kirsten Gillibrand, not Kirsten. Thanks for watching, don't subscribe, and support us like and comment.